It was a party that sparkled. From a distance, the penthouse high above the city was a jewel box of light and sound, a beacon of everything glamorous and out of reach. The people inside moved like beautiful, polished fish in a very expensive tank, their laughter a bright, tinkling noise that did not quite reach their eyes. They were all there for a reason, you see, but the reason was rarely as simple as having a good time. For some, it was to be seen. For others, it was to make a connection that could lead to more money, or more fame. They traded smiles like currency, and their conversations were a delicate dance of showing off and sizing each other up. In this river of silk and shiny suits, there was a single, still rock. Her name was Corryne. She stood by a vast, floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of bubbling water in her hand, looking down at the real world far below. The city lights twinkled like a carpet of fallen stars, and she found them much more honest than the glittering people in the room behind her. She had come to the party with her roommate, Chloe, who had immediately vanished into the crowd, eager to swim with the other beautiful fish. And Corryne had been left behind. For a very, very long time, no one spoke to her. It was as if she had worn a cloak of invisibility. A man in a bright blue jacket bumped into her and didn't say sorry. A woman in a sparkling dress shot her a look, her eyes scanning Corryne's simple black outfit from head to toe, before turning away with a slight, dismissive sniff. Corryne tried a small, friendly smile at a passing couple, but their gaze slid right over her, as if she were made of glass. She was a ghost in a room full of the living, a silent observer to a play where everyone else had a part. The ice in her drink melted, and the soda water became warm and flat, but she kept holding the glass because it gave her hands something to do. She wished she could melt into the window and become one with the cool, dark night outside. Then, a change began to happen. It did not start with a sound, but with a silence. It was a quiet that bled outward from the grand entrance of the penthouse, spreading like a spill. First, the loud laughter by the door choked off. Then, the lively conversations in the center of the room stuttered and died. Finally, even the thumping music from the DJ seemed to falter, as if the very beats were afraid. The crowd, once a tight, noisy knot, began to pull apart, creating a wide path down the middle of the room. It was like watching the sea dividing. And walking down that path was a man. He was not the tallest man in the room, nor was he the loudest. He was dressed in a simple, dark gray suit that fit him perfectly, but it wasn't flashy. He moved with a calm, heavy kind of grace, as if he owned not just the room, but the very air in it. His hair was dark, with silver brushed at his temples, and his face was a mask of quiet calm. You could see, however, that this was a face that had seen things. It was a map of a life that was not always easy. Behind him walked two other men, bigger, with watchful eyes that scanned every corner, every face. They were guards. This man needed guards. A whisper, hissing and urgent, traveled through the party guests. Vincent. It's Vincent Moretti. The name was spoken with a mixture of fear and deep, deep respect. The host of the party, a man who had been boasting loudly all night about his new yacht, suddenly looked very small. He hurried forward, his smile shaky. Mr. Moretti, this is such an honor. We are so glad you could come. The man, Vincent, gave the host a nod so slight it was almost not there. His dark eyes, cool and intelligent, continued their slow sweep of the room. They passed over the famous actress, the billionaire's son, the model in the feather dress. They looked at all the most important, most beautiful people, and found them lacking. It was as if he were reading a book and had found all the characters boring. Then his gaze stopped. It landed on the quiet girl by the window, the one nobody had seen all night. It settled on Corryne. Corryne felt her heart give a hard, painful thump against her ribs. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt like a mouse spotted by a hawk. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, to hide, to run. But she was frozen. His eyes were like anchors, holding her in place. He had seen through her invisible cloak as if it were never there. Without a word to the chattering host, Vincent began to walk. He moved away from the center of power, away from all the important people, and walked with a steady, unhurried pace directly toward the lonely window. The crowd watched, utterly stunned. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick, expensive carpet. He stopped right in front of her. He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the subtle pattern in his tie. He smelled clean, like soap and a faint, spicy scent. He did not smile. He did not introduce himself. He simply looked at her, and for one terrifying second, Corryne thought he was going to tell his men to throw her out for not belonging. Then, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was deep and rough, like stones rolling at the bottom of a river. In the perfect silence, every single person heard the two words he said. Dance with me. It was not a question. It was not a suggestion. It was a command, spoken with such absolute certainty that it did not even occur to the world to disobey. Corryne's mind went blank. Her mouth felt like it was full of sand. She managed a tiny, shaky whisper. I don't. He simply held out his hand. It was a strong hand, with clean, neat nails. On one finger, he wore a heavy silver ring. He waited. He knew she would take it. The entire party was holding its breath. Corryne looked from his hand to his face, and then at the sea of shocked, jealous, confused faces around them. This was the moment. She could shake her head and stay in her safe, invisible world. Or she could take his hand and step into his. Her hand was trembling as she lifted it. She placed her small, cold fingers into his large, warm palm. His fingers closed around hers, firm and sure. He led her away from the window, away from the shadows, and into the very center of the room. The crowd scrambled backward to give them a wide circle of space. The DJ, suddenly understanding what was happening, quickly faded the fast song and put on a slow, haunting melody with a steady, pulsing rhythm. Vincent's other hand came to rest on her waist, guiding her. He was leading, and he was an expert. Corryne, who had felt so clumsy and out of place all night, found her feet moving as if they knew the steps all along. He was that good. He leaned in close, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. Everyone in this room, he said softly, as they moved together, is a shark. They can smell a single drop of fear from a mile away. They smelled your loneliness. They saw that you did not know their silly rules. And so, they decided you were not important. He spun her slowly, his dark eyes never leaving hers. I am not a shark, he stated. I find them to be boring creatures. All they do is swim in circles, thinking only of their next meal. But you stood by that window and you looked at the city as if you were the only real person in a room full of painted dolls. I have been watching you for 20 minutes, Corryne. And I see you. Hearing her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. How did he know her name? The music began to swell, and he drew her closer, their movements becoming more sure, more connected. The world around them, the staring faces, the whispers, the glittering party, all of it faded into a blur. There was only the music, the strong hand guiding her, and the intense, focused man who saw her when no one else did. The song came to its final, dramatic note. Vincent dipped her, a slow, graceful arc that made her gasp softly. For a moment, she was suspended there, looking up at him, completely in his power. Then he brought her back up, steadying her. He released her, took a small step back, and gave her a formal, old-fashioned bow. Then, without another word to her, without a single glance at anyone else in the room, he turned. His two guards fell into place behind him, and he walked back through the path the crowd made for him, out the grand entrance, and was gone. The spell was broken. Noise rushed back into the room, louder than before. But this time, the noise was aimed at Corryne. People surged toward her, their faces now alight with a new, feverish interest. Corryne, what a beautiful dancer you are. I've been wanting to talk to you all night. Where have you been hiding? Let me get you a real drink, that water looks dreadful. Hands touched her arm, voices cooed in her ear. She was the sudden center of the universe she had been shut out of just minutes before. Chloe appeared at her side, her eyes wide with shock and a new, calculating respect. But Corryne barely heard any of it. She stood in the middle of the crowd, her body still humming from the dance, the ghost of his hand warm on her waist. She looked at all the smiling, eager faces, and she understood. They hadn't suddenly become nice. They were just afraid of the man who had noticed her. They were sharks, and a much, much bigger predator had just circled her, marked her, and changed her life forever. The morning after the party arrived not with a gentle nudge, but with the harsh, bright light of reality. Corryne woke up in her small, quiet apartment, the memories of the previous night feeling like a strange, beautiful dream. The soft cotton of her sheets was a world away from the imagined silk of Vincent's suit, and the only sound was the distant hum of city traffic, not the whispered awe of a crowd. She half wondered if she had imagined it all, the silence, the dance, the man who saw her. But the lingering feeling of his hand on her waist, a phantom pressure, told her it was real. The world outside her window was the same, but her place in it had shifted, and she did not yet know how. Down in the street, a car arrived. It was not a flashy, loud car, but a large, dark vehicle that looked both expensive and serious. It parked with a quiet purpose, and a man stepped out. He was not Vincent. This man was younger, with a strong build and a face that gave nothing away. He moved with a similar kind of confidence, but his was the confidence of a well-made tool, a shield, not the sword itself. This was Luca, Vincent's most trusted guard, the man who had stood watchful behind him at the party. He checked a piece of paper in his hand, looked up at Corryne's apartment building, and walked inside. A knock came at Corryne's door. It was not a loud, demanding knock, but it was firm and solid, a sound that brooked no ignoring. Corryne, still in her pajamas, felt a jolt of anxiety. Peering through the tiny peephole, she saw the serious-faced man from the car standing in her hallway. Her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She thought about not answering, about pretending she wasn't home. But she knew, with a deep and sudden certainty, that he knew she was there. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she opened the door just a crack. The man, Luca, looked at her. His eyes were not unkind, but they were assessing, taking in every detail of her and her small apartment in a single, swift glance. "Miss Corryne," he said, his voice as neutral as his expression. "My name is Luca. Mr. Moretti has sent me. He requests your company for lunch." It was not a question. It was a statement, delivered with the same calm certainty as Vincent's dance with me. Corryne's mind raced. This was the part in the story where the sensible girl said no. This was the moment she was supposed to shut the door, to call the police, to retreat back into her safe, invisible life. But the memory of the dance, of being truly seen for the first time, was a powerful lure. The silence of her apartment suddenly felt like loneliness, not safety. I need to get dressed," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Luca gave a single, short nod. "I will wait," he said, and he turned to stand by the door, a silent, patient statue. The car ride was completely silent. Luca did not speak, and Corryne did not dare to ask any questions. She watched the city she knew so well slide past the tinted windows, the familiar streets looking different from inside this quiet, rolling fortress. They drove away from the bustling center, into a neighborhood of old, towering trees and enormous houses set far back from the road, hidden behind high walls and iron gates. It was a world of quiet money and immense privacy. The car slowed and turned, its tires crunching on a pristine gravel driveway. They passed through a massive, black iron gate that swung open silently, and then she saw it. Vincent's house. It was not a loud, modern box like the penthouse from the party. It was a grand, old stone house, the kind that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. It spoke not of new money, but of old, deep roots. It was powerful, and it was quiet. Luca led her through a heavy, wooden front door and into a vast entryway. The inside of the house was just as imposing. The floors were dark, polished wood, and the ceilings were high. There were no bright colors or flashy decorations. Instead, there were bookshelves filled with leather-bound books, a few simple but beautiful vases, and large, comfortable-looking chairs. The air was still and cool, and the only sound was the soft tick-tock of a grandfather clock in a distant room. It was the complete opposite of the noisy, chaotic party. This was a place of order, of control, of deep, unshakable calm. The car slowed and turned, its tires crunching on a pristine gravel driveway. They passed through a massive, black iron gate that swung open silently, and then she saw it. Vincent's house. It was not a loud, modern box like the penthouse from the party. It was a grand, old stone house, the kind that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. It spoke not of new money, but of old, deep roots. It was powerful, and it was quiet. Luca led her through a heavy, wooden front door and into a vast entryway. The inside of the house was just as imposing. The floors were dark, polished wood, and the ceilings were high. There were no bright colors or flashy decorations. Instead, there were bookshelves filled with leather-bound books, a few simple but beautiful vases, and large, comfortable-looking chairs. The air was still and cool, and the only sound was the soft tick-tock of a grandfather clock in a distant room. It was the complete opposite of the noisy, chaotic party. This was a place of order, of control, of deep, unshakable calm. Vincent was waiting for her in a room that was clearly a library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves covered every wall, and the smell of old paper and leather filled the air. He was standing by a large fireplace, not reading, not doing anything, just waiting. He was dressed more casually than at the party, in dark trousers and a simple sweater, but he still carried that same air of immense power. "Corryne," he said, his gravelly voice a familiar sound in the strange quiet. "Thank you for coming." He did not smile, but his eyes were less intense than they had been at the party, more thoughtful. He gestured for her to sit in a large, leather armchair, and he sat in one opposite her. A woman brought in a tray with tea and small sandwiches, setting it on a low table between them before disappearing as silently as she had come. For a long while, they just sat. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy. Vincent seemed in no hurry to fill it. He simply watched her, as if he were giving her time to adjust to the atmosphere of his world. "Those people at the party," he began finally, pouring tea for both of them. "They are like children playing a game. They collect friends like toys, and they throw them away when they are bored. They think power is about being loud, about having the biggest car or the most expensive watch." He handed her a delicate china cup. "That is not power. That is noise." Corryne took the cup, her hands trembling slightly. "What is power, then?" she asked, her voice small in the large, quiet room. Vincent looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers. "Power is silence," he said simply. "It is the ability to make things happen without raising your voice. It is knowing that your word is law, and you do not need to shout it from the rooftops. It is watching and waiting and understanding what others miss." He paused, his gaze drifting to the bookshelves. "It can be a very lonely thing." In that moment, Corryne saw something new in his face. It wasn't the scary Mafia boss, or the commanding dancer. It was a tiredness, a deep and profound loneliness that echoed her own. He had everything, the big house, the guards, the fear of everyone who knew his name, but he had no one who saw the man behind it all. Just like no one at the party had seen her. They talked for what felt like both a minute and a lifetime. He asked her about the books she liked to read. He listened, truly listened, to her answers. He didn't look at his phone, he didn't get distracted. His attention was a laser beam, and it was focused entirely on her. He told her about the history of his house, about the business he ran. He called it importing, though she knew it was likely much more, and he spoke about the city not as a playground, but as a kingdom he felt responsible for. Luca eventually appeared in the doorway, a silent signal that the afternoon was ending. Vincent walked her back to the front door himself. He stopped before opening it, turning to face her. "The world is full of sharks, Corryne," he said, repeating his words from the dance. "But you do not have to be their prey. You have a choice now. You can go back to your old life, and the sharks will eventually forget about you and move on. Or," he said, and his voice was very quiet, "you can stay here, in the quiet. With me." He wasn't threatening her. He was giving her a real choice. But the choice felt immense, like choosing between a small, familiar box and a vast, unknown ocean. "The car will take you home," he said. "Luca will give you a phone. My number is in it. Think about my offer." The heavy door closed behind her, and she was back in the sunlight, the quiet of the house replaced by the sound of birds and the distant rustle of leaves. The car ride home was just as silent, but now her mind was roaring with noise. She thought of her lonely apartment, of the people of the party who only saw her when Vincent did. She thought of the powerful, lonely man in the big, quiet house who saw the real her. He wasn't asking her to be a queen. He was asking her to be a friend. To be someone who understood the silence. And as the city skyline grew closer, Corryne realized that the invisible girl from the party was gone forever. Now, she had to decide what kind of person she would become. The phone Luca had given her was a simple, black device, cool and heavy in her hand. It felt less like a gift and more like a key to a door she had not yet decided to open. For 2 days, it did not ring. Life, on the surface, returned to its old patterns. Corryne went to her classes at the university, she came home to her small apartment, she made simple meals for herself. But the silence of her life was now a different kind of silence. It was no longer just empty, it was waiting. The memory of Vincent's library, of the profound quiet that was full of meaning, made her own world feel hollow. The chatter of her classmates seemed childish, and Chloe's endless questions about Vincent felt like the buzzing of a distant, unimportant fly. On the 3rd day, the phone vibrated with a single, short message. It was not a question. It was a statement. I am sending Luca. There is a book in my library I think you would appreciate. Her heart did a complicated flip, a mixture of fear and a thrilling, undeniable pull. She did not write back. She simply got ready. When Luca's knock came, she was waiting. This became the new pattern. There were no dramatic dates at fancy restaurants, no declarations. There were afternoons in the library. Vincent would be working at his large, dark wood desk, and Corryne would sit in the leather armchair, the one that was starting to feel like hers, and she would read. Sometimes he would ask her what she thought of a certain story. Sometimes he would tell her about a place mentioned in the book, a city he had visited on business. He began to explain his world to her, not as a king boasting of his kingdom, but as a teacher. He told her about the delicate balance of power in the city, about the different groups and families, and how he used respect and, when necessary, fear, to keep a fragile peace. He called it managing the chaos. He was showing her that his power was not about being the strongest bully, but about being the smartest, the most patient player in a very dangerous game. One afternoon, as a soft rain tapped against the library windows, he looked up from his papers and said, "There is a man. His name is Marco. He is ambitious. He does not understand the value of peace. He thinks my ways are old, that I am too soft." Vincent's voice was calm, but Corryne could hear the steel underneath. "He sees my interest in you as a weakness. He believes that by threatening what is important to me, he can make me react without thinking." A cold trickle of fear ran down Corryne's spine. She was no longer just a visitor in this quiet world, she was now a piece on the chessboard. "What is important to you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Vincent's dark eyes met hers across the room. "You are," he said, with a simplicity that stole her breath. It was not a romantic declaration. It was a fact, stated as plainly as he might state the time. "And so, we must be careful." The very next day, the weather had cleared. Feeling a need for normalcy, for the simple act of walking, Corryne decided to go to a small park a few blocks from her apartment. She told herself she was just going for a walk, that she didn't need to tell Luca or anyone. It was a small, foolish act of rebellion, an attempt to cling to a piece of her old, independent self. She was so lost in her thoughts, in the complicated swirl of her feelings for Vincent and this new, dangerous world, that she did not notice the plain, gray van that had been idling down the street now slowly beginning to follow her. She turned a corner onto a quieter street, lined with small shops that were closed for the evening. The sound of the van's engine grew louder, closer. Suddenly, it accelerated, pulling up sharply onto the curb just ahead of her, blocking the sidewalk. The side door slid open with a harsh, metallic sound. 2 large men with cold, determined faces jumped out and moved toward her with swift, practiced purpose. Corryne froze, her mind screaming, her feet rooted to the pavement. This was it. This was the danger Vincent had spoken of. It was no longer a story in a quiet library, it was the rough grab of a hand on her arm, the smell of stale smoke on a man's jacket. But just as one of the men began to pull her toward the open door of the van, a different car, a dark sedan she had not even noticed, screeched to a halt right behind them. The doors flew open and Luca erupted from the driver's seat, his face a mask of cold fury. Another man, one of Vincent's other guards, came from the passenger side. They moved not with panic, but with a terrifying, efficient violence. There were no loud shouts, no dramatic speeches. There was the sickening thud of a fist connecting, a grunt of pain, the scuffle of feet on concrete. Luca moved like a storm, disarming one of the men with a swift, brutal move and shoving him hard against the side of the van. The other guard had the second man on the ground in seconds. The whole confrontation was over in less than a minute. The two men from the van, now bruised and defeated, scrambled back into their vehicle, and the van sped away with a squeal of tires, leaving behind only the smell of burnt rubber and fear. Luca was at her side instantly. His breathing was even, but his eyes were blazing. "Are you hurt, Miss Corryne?" he asked, his voice tight. She could only shake her head, her whole body trembling violently. The reality of the situation crashed down on her. They had tried to take her. They had really tried. Into the car. "Now," Luca commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. This time, she did not hesitate. They did not drive to her apartment. They drove out of the city, the buildings shrinking in the rearview mirror, replaced by the dark shapes of wooded hills. They arrived at a small, nondescript house, tucked away from the main road and surrounded by trees. It was simple, sturdy, and felt utterly isolated. This was one of Vincent's safe houses. Inside, it was clean and spare, with none of the grandeur of his main home. Vincent was already there, waiting in the small living room. He was standing perfectly still, but the air around him crackled with a contained, furious energy. When he saw her, he crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't hug her. Instead, he placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm, his eyes scanning her face, checking for any sign of injury. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice was low, a gravelly rumble of pure anger. "I am so sorry, Corryne. My world, it has touched you. It has put a shadow on you. And for that, I will never forgive myself." He led her to a couch, his hand never leaving her arm, as if he needed the physical connection to assure himself she was safe. Luca stood by the door, a silent sentinel. "This was Marco," Vincent said, the name a curse. "He has made his move. And he has made a very, very large mistake." He turned to face her fully, his expression grim. "I must deal with this. I must end this, or you will never be safe. But before I do, I need you to understand something." He took both of her hands in his. His were warm and steady, while hers were still ice-cold and shaking. "I brought you into the quiet of my life because you were the first real thing I had found in a long time," he said, his gaze intense, boring into her soul. "I thought I could keep you separate, that I could build a wall between you and the darkness. I was wrong. The darkness will always try to find a way in." He took a deep breath. "So, I am giving you a choice. Luca can take you somewhere far away, with a new name and enough money to live a safe, comfortable life. You can forget about me, and this world, and be free." He paused, letting the weight of the offer settle in the quiet room. "Or," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "you can stay. You can stand with me in the quiet, knowing that the shadows are real. I cannot promise you a life without danger. But I can promise you that I will spend every breath in my body keeping you safe. I will protect you with everything I am. I cannot let you go, Corryne. You are the only real thing I have." Corryne looked at him, at this powerful, feared man who was showing her his fear, the fear of losing her. She thought of the lonely girl at the party, the girl no one saw. She thought of the afternoons in the library, of being listened to, of being understood. The fear of Marco, of the van, of the violence, was a cold, sharp thing in her stomach. But the thought of leaving, of going back to a life of being invisible, of never seeing Vincent again, felt like a different kind of death. The invisible girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had been seen, who had been claimed, and who was now being given a terrible, terrifying choice. The safe, normal path was right there, offered to her. But as she looked into Vincent's eyes, she knew that her path had changed the moment he asked her to dance. The quiet, it turned out, was not always peaceful. Sometimes, it was the calm before the storm. And she realized, with a jolt that was both frightening and right, that she did not want to be safe if it meant being without him. The safe house became a world unto itself, a small, quiet bubble of tense waiting. The windows were always covered, and the only sounds were the whisper of the wind outside and the low, serious voices of Vincent and his men as they planned. Corryne's choice had been made not with words, but with a simple, silent nod as she looked at Vincent in that sparse living room. She would stay. And in choosing to stay, she had stepped from the sidelines directly onto the chessboard. She was no longer a prize to be won or lost, she was a player, and she needed to understand the game. Vincent did not hide things from her anymore. He spread maps and photographs on the small kitchen table. He showed her a picture of Marco, a man with a smug, arrogant smile and cold eyes. He explained Marco's businesses, his allies, his weaknesses. "He is a hammer," Vincent said, tapping Marco's photograph with a cold disdain. "He sees every problem as a nail. He believes that strength is only about who can hit the hardest. He is a fool. True strength is about knowing where and when to apply pressure." The plan Vincent devised was not one of brute force. It was a trap, elegant and clever, built on Vincent's deep understanding of his enemy's greed and arrogance. Marco was trying to broker a huge deal, one that would bring a massive shipment of illegal goods into the city, solidifying his power and his wealth. He believed he was being very smart, very secretive. "But he is not the only one who can play this game," Vincent explained, his finger tracing a route on a map. "We will let him believe his plan is working. We will let him gather his shipment, invest all his money, and feel the taste of victory on his tongue." He looked at Corryne, his eyes sharp. "And then, when he is at his most confident, we will take it all away. Not with guns, but with information." Vincent's plan was to anonymously tip off the police. He knew the exact time, the exact location, the exact contents of Marco's shipment. He would let the authorities do the work for him, crippling Marco's operation in one fell swoop and landing him in prison for a very long time. It was a move of brilliant, cold intelligence. It was a checkmate delivered by a whisper, not a shout. The night of the meeting arrived. Marco believed he was meeting a secret business partner at an old, deserted warehouse by the docks to finalize the deal. In reality, he was walking into Vincent's trap. Vincent and his men prepared to leave the safe house, their movements quiet and efficient, checking weapons with a chilling casualness. As Vincent shrugged on his dark coat, Corryne felt a fear colder than any she had felt when the men grabbed her. This was different. This was the fear of waiting, of not knowing, of imagining 100 terrible outcomes. He was walking into a den of snakes, and even with his clever plan, things could go wrong. He turned to her before he reached the door. The fierce anger from the night of the attack was gone, replaced by a calm, steady resolve. "Luca will stay with you," he said. "You will be safe here." But Corryne stepped forward. The trembling, invisible girl from the party was nowhere to be found. In her place stood a woman who had been seen, who had been trusted with the secrets of a king, and who had found a courage she never knew she possessed. She reached out and touched his arm, her hand small against the dark fabric of his coat. He stopped and looked down at her, surprised by the contact. "Vincent," she said, and her voice, though soft, did not shake. She looked directly into his dark, unreadable eyes, pouring all the feeling she had, the fear, the trust, the dawning, terrifying realization of what he meant to her, into her gaze. "Please," she whispered, "come back to me." It was not a command. It was a plea. It was an acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them, of the choice she had made, of the future that hung in the balance. For a long moment, he was perfectly still, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time all over again. Then, he did something he had never done before. He brought his hand up and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin. The touch was surprisingly tender, a stark contrast to the violent world he was about to enter. "I will," he promised, his voice low and certain. Then he turned and was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click. The hours that followed were the longest of Corryne's life. The safe house was oppressively silent. Luca stood watch by the window, a silent statue. Corryne paced the small rooms, her mind racing. She imagined the warehouse, the confrontation, the possible betrayal, the sound of gunfire. She thought of Vincent's plan, so clever, so dependent on everything going exactly right. She understood now the weight he carried, the constant calculation, the endless waiting. This was his life. And she had chosen to share it. Finally, just as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the edges of the window coverings, there was the sound of a car on the gravel outside. Luca moved quickly, his hand going to the weapon at his side, but then he relaxed. "It's him," he said, his voice flat. The door opened and Vincent walked in. He looked tired, his face etched with a deep weariness, but he was unharmed. His clothes were not rumpled, there was no smell of smoke or gunpowder. He had not been in a battle. He had been directing one from a distance. He looked past Luca, his eyes finding Corryne immediately. He walked toward her, and she saw it in his face, the success, the cold satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. "It is done," he said, stopping in front of her. The police arrived exactly on time. Marco and his entire crew were caught with the shipment. "He is finished. His empire is dust." He had done it. He had fought his war with his mind, not with bullets, and he had won. The threat was gone. The shadow had been lifted. But as he stood there, telling her of his victory, his eyes were not on the defeated enemy. They were on her. He was watching her reaction, searching her face not for admiration of his power, but for something else entirely. He had come back to her, just as he promised. And in the quiet of that safe, dawning morning, surrounded by the aftermath of his dark world, Corryne knew that the dangerous, complicated, powerful man standing before her was not just a king protecting his territory. He was a man who had heard her plea, and he had fought his way back to her side. The game was over, but a new, more complicated one was just beginning. With Marco's defeat, the city did not erupt in celebration. There were no parades, no headlines in the newspapers. For most people, it was just another day. But in the world that existed just beneath the surface, the world of quiet power and unspoken rules, the change was seismic. A loud, reckless voice had been silenced, and the steady, calm hand of Vincent Moretti was once again the only law that mattered. The sharks, as Vincent would say, had been reminded of who truly ruled the ocean, and they swam with a new, careful respect. Vincent and Corryne did not return to the way things were before. They could not. The attack, the safe house, her whispered plea for his return, it had all carved channels between them too deep to be ignored. They moved back into the grand, quiet house, but Corryne was no longer just a guest in the library. A space was prepared for her, a sunlit room overlooking the gardens, for her books and her things. It was not a demand from her, but an offering from him, a silent way of saying, "Your place is here, with me." Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of their life together found its own unique beat. Corryne continued her studies, but now Luca was a constant, discreet presence in the periphery, a shadow that ensured her safety without intruding on her life. She learned to accept this, not as a cage, but as the price of the profound love she had found. In the evenings, she and Vincent would still sit in the library, but the conversations had changed. She was no longer just a listener, she was a counselor. He would ask her opinion on matters of business, not because she knew about imports or territory, but because she had a clear, honest way of seeing people, a wisdom that cut through the noise of greed and ambition that usually filled his ears. She became his compass, his touchstone to the real world outside his fortress of power. One evening, as autumn leaves blew in fiery drifts across the lawn, Vincent led her not to the library, but to his private study, a room even more secluded and personal. A simple wooden box sat on his desk. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he turned to her, his hands resting on her shoulders, his gaze more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Corryne," he began, his voice low and serious. "You saw me when I was just a lonely king in a castle of my own making. You were not impressed by my crown or frightened by my power. You saw the man, and you chose to stay. You walked into the shadows beside me, and you brought your own light." He paused, choosing his words with immense care. "I cannot offer you a normal life. I cannot promise you that danger will never knock at our door again. The crown I wear is heavy, and it is not always shiny." He opened the wooden box. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was not a traditional, flashy diamond ring. It was a ring, yes, but the band was a sturdy, polished platinum, and the stone was a deep, dark sapphire, the color of the midnight sky. It was strong, beautiful, and unbreakable, just like the bond they had forged. "I cannot give you a normal life," he repeated, taking the ring from the box. "But I can give you my life. All of it. The quiet and the storms. The peace and the battles. I can give you my loyalty, my protection, and my heart, for as long as I live.
Will you rule this life with me?
Not as my queen in a palace, but as my partner in everything. Tears welled in Corryne's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of overwhelming understanding. He was not asking her to be a trophy. He was asking her to be his equal, to share the weight of the crown, to be the one person in the world he could trust completely. He was offering her not a fairy tale, but a reality, complex, dangerous, and more deeply loving than any dream. She looked from the ring to his eyes, seeing the hope and the fear there, the powerful man laid bare before her. She thought of the invisible girl at the party, the one who had longed to be seen. That girl was gone forever. In her place was a woman who was seen, who was known, and who was loved for her true self, shadows and all. Yes, she said, her voice clear and sure, a world away from the timid whisper of the girl he had first asked to dance. I will. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, a cool, solid weight, a promise. He pulled her into his arms with a quiet, deep embrace that felt like coming home. They stood there, in the heart of his quiet kingdom, two people who had been lost in their own ways, now found in each other. If you followed the journey of the invisible girl who found her strength and the lonely king who found his heart, then there are so many more stories waiting for you. To make sure you never miss the next tale of love, courage, and unexpected twists, be sure to subscribe to the channel. A simple click helps us continue bringing these stories to life for you.
Thank you for listening.